If you want things to completely change, you're going to support me.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just dropped out of the presidential race. He'd done pretty well for an independent candidate. At one point, polls had his support in double digits.
You should vote for me.
Kennedy knew what to say to appeal to libertarians.
Real patriotism means protecting the United States Constitution.
I liked hearing that, but would he have really done that? Who is RFK Jr.? Well, here's our full interview, taped before President Biden dropped out. Plus, at the end, my own fact-checking on 3 important points. Why should you be president? Who are you? Why are you superior to the other 2 guys?
Well, the other 2, their approach to politics is different. Their disposition.
Yeah, I don't care about that. Why should you be president?
But they're operating within a very narrow Overton window. If you look at what they argue about, what they're disputing about, it's called mainly cultural war issues. It's guns, it's the border, it's abortion, trans rights, and these issues. The really existential issues, neither of them can talk about. And that's what I'm talking about. The national debt is $34 trillion that President Trump and President Biden are responsible for largely. President Trump said that he was going to balance the budget, and instead he spent more money than every president in United States history, $8 trillion. President Trump Biden is on track now to beat him. The addiction to war that we have in our country, particularly the Ukraine war, which was a war of choice. It's an immoral war. It was an unnecessary war. And both of them were involved in creating that war.
So let's break
division in our country, this toxic polarization that is tearing our country apart, that's worse than any time since the Civil War.
We'll
cover these gentlemen ideas, are feeding on it.
We're going to talk for a while. So first tell the audience why you sound hoarse.
I have a disease called spasmodic dystonia, and I got it when I had a very, very strong voice until I was 46 years old. And I got this. It's actually a neurological injury, and it causes my voice to sound kind of strangled. I actually am, it was much worse than this for a long period of time. I had surgery on it in Japan about a year ago, and that helped me a lot. And then I'm doing some treatments now that are helping me. But, my voice stinks. I can't listen to myself. I feel sorry for people who have to listen to me. It's an ironic impediment because so much of my life and profession is based upon my, me talking in courtrooms, on, television, on radio. It's ironic.
Well, let's make it worthwhile for people to listen to you. You raised 2 big issues, the debt and war. Let's start with war. What would you do about Ukraine?
I would end the Ukraine war. I would negotiate a peace. President Putin has repeatedly tried to negotiate a peace. There's one issue that worries him, and it's an issue that he should be worried about, which is us moving NATO into Ukraine. Russia's been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time when Hitler invaded it, he killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We made a commitment to Gorbachev, to the Soviet Union back in 1992, that if we were allowed to reunite Germany, East and West Germany, under a NATO army, and the Soviets moved out 450,000 troops, and we moved ours in, which was an extraordinary concession for them. The one condition he asked for is that if he allowed us to do that, we would not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was then Secretary of State for George Bush, famously told Gorbachev, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And then, the neocons got a hold of the White House, starting with Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they started moving to the east. Because every time they move into a new nation, that nation has to conform its weapons purchases to NATO specifications. So, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed make billions of dollars. And so there's a huge drive in Congress to try to continually move NATO to the east. But,
there is a war machine, but what would you do as president?
I would negotiate a peace. And,
you would say, well, Russia, you could keep the territory you've conquered?
Well, I'm not going to say exactly what my endpoint would be on negotiations. I negotiate for a living. I've negotiated ends to hundreds of lawsuits, and that's not how you do it. But Putin made a tremendous concessions in April of 2022. And he agreed when he had just moved in, and Zelensky wanted to negotiate a peace agreement. We wouldn't help him. The United States would not help him. So he went to Israel and got Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to help, and Erdogan in Turkey. They negotiated a treaty in Istanbul, and that treaty, the primary thing that Putin wanted was to keep an agreement to permanently keep Ukraine neutral, to keep NATO out. And everybody agreed on it. Putin began withdrawing his troops, left Donbass and Lugansk as part of Ukraine. And Joe Biden got Boris Johnson to go to Kiev and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And since then, 600,000 kids have died unnecessarily. My own son fought in Ukraine for the Foreign Legion. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive. All of those Ukrainians shouldn't have died. They've lost the war. We were told they were going to win the war. Most of us knew who understood what was happening. There was no way that we could ever win that war, and that it was a catastrophe. But the White House, Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines.
Right, but you're giving me history again. I'm just not clear on what you would do. Stop giving any money to Ukraine?
Putin asks almost every time he's in public to negotiate. So you at least negotiate. My uncle realized in 1962 that he was surrounded by war hawks in his intelligence apparatus and his military brass. And he realized that they knew nothing about Khrushchev and that they were telling him things about Khrushchev that they didn't know, and that he needed to begin talking to Khrushchev directly. He began corresponding with him secretly. They exchanged 26 different letters, and then he installed a hotline so that he could talk to him directly. And I grew up with that hotline in our house at the Cape. But he always said, if you want peace, you've got to understand your adversary. You've got to be able to talk to them. And Biden has never talked to Putin about this, and it's criminal. Putin has repeatedly said, I want peace, I want to negotiate, and nobody's there negotiating. In fact, Zelensky has now passed a law that makes it illegal to negotiate with Putin. I mean, imagine that. It's nobody wants that except for extremists, very, very right-wing extremists in Ukraine.
What about Gaza? What about Israel, Hamas? What would you do?
It's heartbreaking what's happening. I consider myself very pro-Palestinian, but Israel is...
What does that mean to be very pro-Palestinian?
It means that, I believe that Palestinians should have control and sovereignty over their own destiny. And I also don't blame Israel for what's happened in Gaza. I blame Hamas. Hamas is a proxy for Iran. It is a genocidal organization by its own statements. Its only objective is to annihilate Israel and to exterminate the Jews. And it's a kleptocracy. It steals from the Palestinian people. Israel now is in an existential fight. It's fighting a 5-front war against Shia militias that are funded by Iran in Iraq and Syria, against the Houthis in Yemen, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and against Hamas in Gaza. And Islamic Jihad and a bunch of other, smaller groups that are all funded by Iran. And I don't think that it's right to micromanage Israel's battle against Hamas. I think that Israel has to close out that front because it's very vulnerable right now.
America should keep giving arms and money to Israel?
Yes, of course we should. But if we don't do that, we should be contemplating that there may be no Israel within 5 years. Israel is facing indomitable strength now with Iran, and groups like Hezbollah this isn't the Hezbollah that it fought in 2000. This is the best guerrilla army perhaps that ever existed on Earth. And they are a very formidable foe. They have 250,000 missiles, many of them guided missiles. And they work hand in hand with Iran and with Hamas and with all these other organizations. And their purpose is to obliterate, to annihilate Israel. And, I don't feel that it would be good for the United States or in our national security interest to live in a world where there is no Israel, where there is no barrier against, against Iran's expansion in the Mideast.
But you're the unusual presidential candidate to acknowledge the debt, and you don't want to cut this spending. What would you cut?
Well, Israel's spending is rather minor. We've spent $8 trillion on regime change wars, and I would not have brought, I think, every war that we've brought for the last 100 years, with one exception, has been a war of choice and an immoral war. The only exception is World War II. World War I was an immoral war. My grandfather fought it and lost a lot of his relationships because of that, a lot of his
Every
friendships.
war since World War II, immoral.
No, even before World War II, for the last 100 years.
Vietnam, immoral.
Vietnam was an immoral war, of course.
Grenada, immoral.
All of them were. They're all wars of choice. There's wars that we shouldn't be involved in. We are not the policemen of the world. John Quincy Adams, he said, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Eisenhower said the same thing on my birthday in 1961, January 17th, in his farewell address.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
He said the biggest threat to America is the emergence of a military-industrial complex that will take control of our foreign policy and then destroy democracy from within. And that's exactly what's happening right now. We have, the intelligence apparatus in this country that has been captured by the military contractors, and its job is to lie to the American people and to create these super villains every couple of years, Saddam Hussein and, or Vladimir Putin. And
so you would cut the military?
I would cut the military.
$800 billion now? We'd cut to $400 billion?
I'd cut it to about $500 billion during my first 4 years. And by the way, that is the Eisenhower minimum. That would put us at the same level in 2024 dollars as we were during the height of the Cold War. And if that was sufficient to protect America during the height of the Cold War, it ought to be sufficient now. But I've also got great military advisors who say, most of the money in the military now, tremendous amount of waste. But also, it's not about protecting America, it's about dominating the globe. And that is a losing bargain. We should be projecting what my uncle wanted to do, project economic power abroad and not military power. My uncle said,
Which uncle?
John F. Kennedy. He said the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. He said he wanted on his gravestone, he kept the peace, and he never sent a combat unit abroad to fight. And he kept us out of Laos in 61. He kept us out of Cuba in 61. He kept us out of Germany in 62. He kept us out of Cuba again in 62 and 63. And he kept us out of Vietnam. He sent only military advisors. And 30 days before he died, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all military, 16,000 military advisors home from Vietnam. So, because he heard that Green Beret had died, and he learned that 75 men had died at that point, he said, that's too many. And 30 days later, he was assassinated. So, and he said he didn't want kids in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Alliance for Progress. He wanted them to think of USAID, these programs that he created to build the middle class, to end run the oligarchs and the military dictators and go and aid directly the middle class, to try to build a middle class, to put America on the side of the poor.
So you've saved us $300 billion, but the deficit is much bigger.
The biggest cost is treating chronic disease.
Well, it's Social Security and Medicare is the biggest cost.
The biggest cost is chronic disease. That's $4.3 trillion. It's 5 times our military budget. There's nothing like it. And it's gone from when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60%. And the cost of healthcare as a result of that has gone up to almost 20% of our GDP from about 6%. We have the sickest people in the world. There's nobody else who has a chronic disease burden that we do. And that's one of the reasons we had the highest death rate from COVID of any country in the world.
Chronic diseases like
neurological diseases, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD. Autism has gone from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids in my kids' generation, 1 in every 22 boys. Autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes. When I was a kid, the typical pediatrician would see 1 case of juvenile diabetes in his lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is pre-diabetic or diabetic.
Because Americans got fat.
Well, no, Americans are getting poisoned by processed food, 1,000 ingredients in our processed foods.
So it's partly vaccines, partly processed foods, chemicals.
It's pharmaceuticals, it's chemicals in our water, specific chemicals, glyphosate. You can see the timeline because Congress actually said, the EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. And EPA came back and said it's a red line, 1989. Well, that's the year all the food allergies started. There were, I never knew anybody. I had 11 siblings and 71st cousin. I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my 7 kids have those kind of allergies?
Mine too.
Right, autoimmune disease. I mean, this is not normal, John. This is from mass poisoning our children.
But you say, look at the trend. Here's the trend. We're living longer than ever.
Over the past 10 years, we've had the steepest drop in life expectancy in American history. A dramatic drop over the past 10 years.
We had a dramatic.
What?
Yeah, the drop is shown here, but
that's the drop.
This is white men overdosing and COVID.
It's chronic disease as well. And by the way, why did we have the highest death rate from COVID? Here's what CDC says. We have 16% of the COVID deaths. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. So whatever we were doing was worse than any country in the world.
Because we're overweight?
What CDC says is that the average person who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. They had obesity, as you point out, and diabetes, they had asthma, and one other thing. That's why we're dying. We're the sickest group of people in the world. We pay more for healthcare 2 to 3 times per capita what Europeans pay. And we're 79th in terms of outcome behind Mongolia, behind Nicaragua, behind Costa Rica, behind Cuba. Oh, somebody needs to explain this, what's happening. And we know what's happening. Anybody who's
My understanding, it's because Americans are overweight. We drive more and kill each other on the highways, and we shoot each other more often.
We're overweight. Do you think people just got lazy? Or do you think something is happening? All of these neurological diseases, obesity is a chronic disease. It's
caused by chemicals that we're being exposed to.
It's caused by, probably the biggest culprit is probably high fructose corn syrup. If you look, for example, you look at the Pima Indians. The Pima Indians are in New Mexico, and then there's another population in Mexico. The Pima Indians in Mexico have a life expectancy of 47 years. The Pima Indians right across the border have a life expectancy of almost 80 years. They're skinny, there's no diabetes, they're in good shape, and they live forever. On our side of the border, they die like flies, and they're obese, they're diabetic, they're asthmatic, they have all kinds of cardio diseases. Why is that? It's because they're eating processed foods and it's poisoning them.
Let's come back to that and we can debate that. But the big exciting thing you say is you acknowledge we have a horrible debt and that this is going to be a problem. I don't see what you're willing to cut.
Well, I'm going to end the chronic disease epidemic. I'm going to end it very quickly, and that is going to dramatically reduce healthcare.
You're going to just stop all chemicals from being used?
No, I'm going to. Right now, John, NIH refuses to study what the etiology of chronic disease is, and why did they? Because they don't want to offend the pharmaceutical companies, the processed food companies, the chemical companies that are at the core of it.
They offend them all the time. They reject 90% of their submissions. The big rich companies are terrified of the FDA and the NIH.
The NIH has a $42 billion budget. It distributes that money to 56,000 scientists, mainly in universities around the country and then some outside of the country. When I was a boy, they were studying science. They were answering questions like what is making Americans sick? What are the health threats? In 1980, we changed the law. We passed the Bayh-Dole Act. And that law said that NIH scientists could collect royalties on any drug that they assisted in developing, and that NIH itself could collect royalties. So, for example, the Moderna vaccine is 50% owned by NIH, and they will make tens of billions of dollars on it. And there are 6 individuals at NIH who have margin rights for the patent, who are Tony Fauci's closest deputies, and they collect $150,000 a year forever. As long as mRNA products are on the market, they will be collecting that. They're paying for their mortgages, their boats, their children's education, their alimonies, and that financial opportunity has subsumed the regulatory function of NIH. NIH now has become the biggest incubator for pharmaceutical drugs. In 2016, FDA approved 220 new drugs. All of them were developed by NIH. And this is the very, very corrupt. And what they're doing is, instead of telling us what's causing the chronic disease and ending it, they are profiting from it. And the pharmaceutical industry is profiting from it. They're making tons of money on our illness, and they have very little incentive to make us better.
Well, this is news to me, and I can't argue with you. I'll investigate this. But exciting as it is to hear you talk about saving us by cutting the debt, I just don't hear the details. And when I look at your campaign videos, you're going to add new things.
I'm going to restore affordable home ownership to every American. I'm going to create a federal program that backs mortgages at 3%. Imagine that you had a rich uncle who was willing to co-sign your mortgage. Well, I'm going to make Uncle Sam that rich uncle. That's not going to add anything to the debt if you read how we're going to finance that.
But that's a giveaway.
It's a loan guarantee, and it's guaranteed, and it's funded by the issuance of 3% by 3% Treasury bonds that are tax-free.
But that's a giveaway.
Listen, we have to. Well, that's not a giveaway, but what we need to do, everything I spend, every nickel I spend, every dollar that I spend as president, is going to go toward building our economy. And if we don't do that, we're going to be destroyed by the debt, because when the debt is this large, you cannot cut your way out of it. You have to cut dramatically, and I'm going to do that.
But where?
Well, I'm going to cut the military in half. I'm going to cut the chronic disease epidemic, and then I'm going to do massive cuts of waste, and I'm going to use AI and blockchain to identify that waste. So right now, the Pentagon audit, I'll give you an example. The Pentagon audit.
Well, with the Pentagon, we've already got $300 billion.
I'm going to give you, it's just an example of the waste in the federal government. The Pentagon audit just came out. The Pentagon lost $4 trillion. So they failed their audit. They don't know what happened to it.
They fail every year.
They don't know what happened to it. For 20 years, they failed. The big failure is they don't know what happens to their inventory. And we can get AI walkers to go through the stockpiles, identify all of that waste. Every year, the GAO publishes, and the Congressional Budget Office jointly publish a list of the most wasteful programs in government. Those documents are this thick, and they go and sit on a shelf in the Library of Congress. I'm going to go through those documents, and I'm going to pick the most wasteful programs, and I'm going to put them all in one bill. And I'm going to send them to Congress with an up and down vote, the same way we did with the Bates closure commissions. Oh, I'm going to identify using AI, which has never been done before. AI is very dangerous for us, but it has a big opportunity. It can make government more accountable, more transparent, and that's how I'm going to use it. And we're going to identify the waste, and we're going to eliminate it. I'm going to eliminate almost all the functions of the Department of Education.
Why not kill the whole department? Who needs a federal department?
I would keep the research function of that because we want to know how kids are doing. We want to be able to identify the places where kids are failing. We want to be able to know how our kids are doing compared to kids in other countries to find out what's working in other countries as well. So I think the research department, the data analysis and collection departments are important for us. But as I said, any expenditure I make is going to come from cuts, and it also is going to be designed to increase GDP, because that's the only way out of this debt disaster that is facing us.
I thought what increases GDP is when government gets out of the way and lets greedy entrepreneurs invent things.
We can't cut our way completely out of the debt. If you spend $1 million on military arms, which we're now spending, almost actually now 9.4 billion. If you create 2 jobs on weapons. If you spend $1 million on childcare, you create 22 jobs, and that increased GDP. And so anything that I do, I'm going to ask the Congressional Budget Office in advance: is this going to produce more revenue, more GDP than we're spending? And if it's not, I'm not going to do it.
One area we're spending a lot is trying to fight climate change.
My approach on climate has always been about free markets. And, what I would do, and what I've advocated for many, many years, is to get rid of the subsidies. So you cut, there's $5.2 trillion in subsidies that are given annually to the carbon industry.
Trillions to the carbon industry?
They
get an oil depletion allowance, but I'm not aware of subsidies.
The oil depletion allowance is a very, very small part of it. There's also the highway subsidies that, in places like West Virginia and Kentucky, you need 18 inches of asphalt on the highway, 12 inches, 10 inches. They cost millions of dollars per lane per mile. And the coal industry, because the coal trucks weigh 90,000 pounds, that's a subsidy. And there are many, many other subsidies. I mean, for example, ozone and particulates from coal burning power plants cause about $500 billion in respiratory illness every year. That's a subsidy. That's an indirect subsidy.
Coal burning power plants are a problem, but they're disappearing.
No, they're not disappearing. There'll probably never be a new one built in this country, but they're being built elsewhere in the world in those countries.
Right.
And because we don't have a market-based approach, those coal plants are valuable because they're fully amortized. And so they can burn coal all day without paying interest on them. And if you look just at the plant, the capital investment of the plant, your utility is not going to want to replace it. So right now, to build a new coal burning power plant is about $3.6 billion a gigawatt. To build a solar plant is about $1 billion a gigawatt. To build a coal...
I'm not being taxed to build.
No, you're not.
I am being taxed to give you and other politically connected people subsidies for solar.
You're being taxed for a coal plant too, and you're being taxed for oil. There's all the deductions.
So we should stop all these subsidies.
Yeah,
including the one that
I would say this, John. If you want to be philosophical about this, I would say there's no justification ever for subsidies to a mature industry. And the oil industry is the second richest industry in the world. Why are we giving them any subsidies? You might want to give subsidies to nascent industries for national security reasons. For example, when George Washington became president, he could not find a suit. He wanted to find a suit that was manufactured in the United States. There was no such thing. He had to bring in an Italian tailor and British cloth. And they began subsidizing at that point the seeding of fabric factories, mainly and mills, mainly in New England. And it created a massive industry in our country after a few years of help from the government. So I think there is an excuse for seeding industries with subsidies for strategic regions, for national security reasons. But no, mature industries should never get subsidies. I'm against them, but we also need to build.
I mean, you have a solar plant that got a government guaranteed loan, big one.
Yeah, I built a lot of solar plants, and I built, and I've been involved in the wind industry.
Why should you get a government subsidy?
Well, like I said, for that same reason, if you're going for national security reasons, if you're going to reduce, if you're creating a new industry, you're competing with the Chinese. The Chinese are fully subsidizing it. You want the United States to own pieces of that industry, which is going global. There's a reason to do that so that we're not completely dependent on Chinese technology. There's national security reasons to reduce our dependence on foreign energy sources like Saudi Arabia, which get us in wars, which are a subsidy. We spend $8 trillion on oil wars. That should be, in a true free market economy, those costs would be reflected in the price of gasoline at the pump, but they're not. They're getting it for free. It's not free, though. We're paying from it, but a different pocket. We're paying for it in our taxes, and our kids are paying in inflation. It's another subsidy.
You and I clearly have different opinions about what we should do and climate change, and because once you made a speech saying,
next time you see John Stossel or Glenn Beck, these flat earthers, these corporate toadies lying to you, companies like Exxon that consistently put their private financial interests ahead of American interests, this is treason, and we need to start treating them now as traitors.
Now, I don't really think you want to have me executed for treason, but maybe you do. But my argument was that it's not a crisis that we need to throw money at you for. The Dutch built dikes years ago to keep the water out. We can adjust to climate change. It's a problem. But most of the stuff we're doing now, including subsidizing you, isn't going to make any difference while China is building those coal plants.
I'm not in that business anymore, John. And, I think that statement that I made, I don't know how many years ago, but it's not a statement that I would make today.
Good. Well, I think you wouldn't be talking if it were.
Well, I would be talking anyway because I'll talk to anybody. But I would say it was an imprudent statement at that time. I definitely wouldn't make it today, particularly after COVID, when we saw the use of a crisis by elites around the globe to clamp down totalitarian controls, to obliterate our constitutional rights in so many different ways, and to shift wealth upward. In our country, we closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. We closed, we banned jury trials against any corporation that was providing countermeasures. We got rid of freedom of assembly with social distancing regulations. We got rid of freedom of speech. The government was censoring critics. They began censoring critics of COVID. They ended up by censoring critics of the Ukraine war and other government policies. We got rid of, we closed all the churches for a year with no scientific citation, no due process, no just compensation, no environmental impact statements, none of the, no notice and comment
awful.
rulemaking.
We totally agree, and thank you
And so I understand. I think climate is existential. I think it's human caused, climate change, but I don't insist other people believe that, and I don't think that people who disagree with that are unpatriotic or traitors. So I apologize to you for saying that about you years ago.
But what difference will it make if we spend billions on solar plants, if China builds coal plants and India?
First of all, that I don't really want to get in that argument with you.
Let me drop it. Let me go on to.
I can make that argument, and you and I can talk about that all day. But I'm not
nuclear power.
Arguing for free markets. I think we should create a national grid which allows all kind of, and then the lowest cost providers should prevail in the marketplace. And I believe those will be the most efficient, which means the least polluting providers. But we should end all the subsidies, including the environmental subsidies, and let the market dictate. In a true free market economy, would promote efficiency. Efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. A true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich, without enriching your community.
Everybody
what
wins.
Polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. And that's, I think that's my approach to environmental regulation is markets.
Good. And America has reduced our carbon output more than other countries. But it did it by fracking for natural gas, which you want banned. You don't want nuclear power either. I don't see how this jibes with...
Both those statements are wrong. What I've said about nuclear power is that I would welcome nuclear power if it can be made safe and if it can be made commercially viable, efficient. Right now, to build the last nuclear power plant built is the one in Georgia, which is up around, it's got a 10-year overrun at $34 trillion or $34 billion. It's running $34 billion a gigawatt, I believe.
Because of all the government regulation. They couldn't open, but you got the
if you're saying we should deregulate nuclear power, I would depart from you on that because, in the industry, first of all, people say it's safe. Right? If it's safe, they should get an insurance policy. They can't. There's no insurance company that will write them a policy. So they went to Congress in a sleazy legislative maneuver in the middle of the night, and they passed the Price-Anderson Act that frees them from liability or caps at minimal, trivial amount their liability for accidents. So that's not free markets. That is corporate crony capitalism, and I don't believe in it. And right now, and what did we do with the waste? They're storing the waste. There's still there's still no program for that. That is all put on the backs of the taxpayer. We are stuck with the bill for storing this stuff for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. And that I believe that. And actors in the marketplace should pay all the costs of getting their product to market, including the costs of cleaning up their mess, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. And the industry cannot, there's no utility on earth that will build a nuclear power plant unless it's fully subsidized by the government. And the waste disposal is fully subsidized by the government. And the insurance is fully subsidized. It's all subsidies. If they can pay their own way, if they can buy an insurance policy, I'm all for them.
Where are we going to get power? You wanted fracking
We have
banned?
lots of, no, I didn't say that I wanted fracking banned. What I said is that fracking should pay its costs. And right now, it's not doing that in most parts of this country. And there are so many costs attended for it. Right? Listen, I was in Dimock, Pennsylvania a couple of days ago, watching fire come out of a faucet from fracking. And every home in that neighborhood has, when they can literally light a cigarette lighter under their faucet, turn their faucet on, and it'll flame like a lighter. That's from fracking. Now, those people's houses are now worthless.
That was made famous in a movie.
Well, yeah, but I was there 2 weeks ago, and it's still there, and they've never been paid compensation. The water trucks, there's about, for every well, every time they frack, it's about 4,000 trips in trucks. Those trucks weigh from 40 to 90,000 pounds. They destroy the rural roads in places like Pennsylvania. Who pays for that? who should pay for that? Shouldn't it be the fracking company?
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
But
they're imposing the cost. They should pay for it, but they don't have to.
So you want them to be able to operate? You did not propose
I would
banning
say, of
fracking?
course, if they're paying all of their costs and they're not externalizing their costs, then they should be allowed to operate. And what I've said, the one regulation that the fracking industry is mad at me about is that I don't think we should be allow LNG facilities for exporting frack gas. The frack gas should be used in this country. It should be used to rebuild our industry in this country. Otherwise, we're shouldering all the costs, and then we're paying for it to be shipped abroad.
But they give us money when
so
we
that
ship.
Europe can compete us. These aren't companies that are owned necessarily by Americans, and they're not benefiting us. And they're imposing huge costs on us. And we should get the benefit of those costs by having cheap gas in this country for the time being. The gas is going to run out very quickly in this country. The wells are depleting much faster than anybody predicted. If we run out of frack gas, we're going to be reliant on two countries, Iran, Qatar, and Russia, for the next 50 years. And that's not a good thing for America. Right now, we have a tremendous advantage. If we want to rebuild our industrial base in this country, our manufacturing base, we have the cheapest energy in the world here. And we should keep it in this country. For many years, it was, until 2 or 3 years ago, it was illegal to export crude oil for the same reason. Because we should be using that here to build our industrial base and give us an advantage around the world.
But when we ship LNG, that's liquid natural gas, overseas, they give us money.
They don't give us money. They give them money to the
company, which
board of
spends
directors, which is Canadian owned, or it's not coming back here, John, and it's not coming to the people on whom the burden of fracking falls. And any community where fracking is done, it extracts an enormous burden. It changes those communities forever. It poisons the water. It destroys the roads. It changes the culture, and then you have to pay. You have to pay for the pipes, and and those pipes are cutting through people's homes, through their fields, through their backyards, and that is imposing a cost in this country. And what I'm saying is that if Americans are going to put up with those costs, we should get the advantage of it. And it's not just the shareholders of a company that could be owned by the Chinese.
To pay for the pollution, gas should cost $12 a gallon?
Pollution cost. And that was reflected in the price of oil. Then we'd be paying $12 at the pump, and we'd be sending the correct signals to the marketplace.
If that's the cost of pollution, and then people will choose the cheaper form of energy, which is that's how free market capitalism works, John.
But when a company proposed a wind farm near your home, you and your family opposed it. Seems hypocritical.
I oppose offshore wind anywhere, except, in places where it's not going to do any damage. But, right now we're exterminating the right whale in the North Atlantic through these wind farms. You're seeing these whale kills, dolphin kills. It's very, very destructive of wildlife. It is destructive of these traditional fisheries. And I was representing the commercial fishermen on the Cape. And they said their livelihoods and their culture, which we've had 350 years of commercial fishermen on Cape Cod. And they said if they built Cape Wind, they would be out of business. So, and I'm happy to talk about all the reasons for that. But when offshore, and also it's heavily subsidized. So it was costing, the cost of per kilowatt hour of offshore wind was about 32 cents. If you buy, my brother was building wind plants at that time, and he was charging 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Oh, and why would we build it offshore when we got the best wind on earth in our country? And you can build onshore wind for 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and why in the world accept a boondoggle to the big companies like General Electric, Siemens, Vestas, that own Congress? So they're getting these subsidized construction of wind farms offshore that are destroying whale populations, destroying dolphin populations, and are raising the cost of our energy. It makes no sense.
All right, I would love to talk about that more, but we're low on time and I want to get to vaccines. If your kids were young now, would you give them the measles, the mumps vaccine?
No. I got measles, mumps when I was a kid. It was
Lots of people die from them, used to die from those diseases.
well, you know what? They died in the 1900s or early 1900s. There were about 10,000 Americans a year who died. In 1964, there was about 300 or 400 who died, and they were almost all severely malnourished kids, mainly from the Mississippi Delta. This was before the poverty program, so there was a lot of starving children in our country. It's very, very hard to kill a healthy child with any infectious disease, but particularly with measles. And the World Health Organization now says vitamin A is an absolute cure for measles, which we didn't know about back then. Back then, we were treated with chicken soup, and it was, a week at home watching Leave It to Beaver, and every kid caught it. Every single kid got it. And I had 11 brothers and sisters, and we all got it, and we were all fine. And there are lots and lots of studies out there now that show that kids who get measles as a child are much healthier when they grow up, that they're much more resistant to cancers, to atopic diseases, to allergies, and to heart disease.
You went to Samoa. You convinced people not to get the measles vaccine. An outbreak resulted in 83 deaths.
Yeah, well, that story is not true. First of all, the Prime Minister of Samoa stayed the measles vaccine after measles vaccines killed a number of people in Samoa, including members of his family. So when I went to Samoa, the ban was already in place. And I visited people in Samoa. I didn't know there was no policy that resulted from my going to Samoa. Secondly, nobody died in Samoa from measles. They were dying from a bad vaccine. And the vaccine was imported from Australia and given to people who had measles, which is not recommended. The same measles outbreak hit Tonga, which is the neighboring island, and nobody died because they didn't get the vaccine. So this is more propaganda by the pharmaceutical industry, which is, drumming up a lie to try to discredit me. But if you actually look into it, John, you'll find that it is not true.
And you still say that autism is caused by vaccines?
Yeah, autism is caused by vaccines. And by the way, CDC's own data, they did a study called the Verstratton study in 1989. And they looked at the hepatitis B vaccine. They looked at children, and from the biggest database in the world, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, they looked at children who got the hepatitis B vaccine during their first 30 days, and they compared those to kids who got it later or didn't get it at all. And there was a 1,350% elevated risk for autism among the people who got the vaccine.
There may well be, but there are studies with millions of people. You ignore the big studies.
You have this wrong. There's a series of about 13 studies that were done by people we call biostitutes. One of them was the leading one, who are people who do these studies for money for CDC. They were paid for by CDC in order to create the illusion that vaccines don't cause autism. The chief scientist was a guy called Paul Thornton, who CDC laid, and his study is the most cited study for this proposition. And Paul Thornton is now a fugitive. He's wanted by Interpol. He stole millions of dollars from CDC that he had claimed to use on this study, but he was building houses, buying motorcycles, and living a life of luxury. And his study is absolute fraud. And yet they have not retracted it because CDC is a dishonest organization. It continues to be cited in the literature. And by the way, John, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies. I've written a book, if you're interested, called Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak, that has, I think, 1,400 references and over 400 studies cited that link autism and other related neurological injuries to vaccines. There is no question about it. If you actually read the literature, if you listen to what the propaganda that CDC tells you, yeah, vaccines don't cause autism. But it's propaganda. This is a captive agency that is intertwined and owned by the pharmaceutical industry.
You could really drown in the weeds about this. I'm struck by how you seem to lately be more of a threat to Trump, but the Democrats are fighting harder to keep you off the ballot. And the stuff from Joy Reid on MSNBC, the dangerous forces behind his bid for the presidency. And Labor Secretary Robert Reich is saying you're sending out Nazi dog whistles. Have you seen his video he posted? It's crazy.
He's a dangerous nutcase, but his vision for our future is tainted by his endorsements of hateful conspiracy theory.
He's been kind of not in touch with reality and completely unwilling to kind of engage me.
He won't debate you?
No, nobody will. None of them will. They won't have me on any of their networks. No, but the only live interview I did was with Aaron Burnett, but nobody else will do a live interview, and most of them won't do any interviews at all.
I can see they want to avoid a live interview because you get into the weeds of vaccine science, and we feel not all of it's true.
Yeah, well, if it's not true, then argue with me or post something afterwards that just says we differ with this.
Well, I wish we could talk more about this, but I'm told we're out of time. Thank you, Robert Kennedy.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for being here today.
His campaign limited our interview to 1 hour. If we'd had more time, I would have pushed him harder on some of his claims. Now, he did say,
if it's not true, then argue with me or post something afterwards that just says we differ with this.
I'll do that now about 3 things. First, Kennedy said this about fracking.
I was in Dimock, Pennsylvania a couple days ago, watching fire come out of a faucet from fracking.
This anti-fracking movie, Gasland, publicized that and also blamed fracking. But the movie and Kennedy are wrong. It's true that faucet water sometimes can catch fire, but it's wrong to blame fracking.
There are many places in America where no fracking is done, but water still catches fire.
This happens because of naturally occurring gas that's already in the ground. The director of President Obama's EPA said,
in no case have we made a definitive determination that the fracking process has caused chemicals to enter groundwater.
Also, during our interview, I said to Kennedy, you went to Samoa. You convinced people not to get the measles vaccine. An outbreak resulted in 83 deaths.
Well, that story is not true. First of all, the Prime Minister of Samoa stayed the measles vaccine after measles vaccines killed a number of people in Samoa. So when I went to Samoa, the ban was already in place.
That is true. My question was poorly worded. I shouldn't have quoted this magazine article that suggested his visit caused the deaths. But Kennedy's wrong when he says,
nobody died in Samoa from measles.
Many did die. A Lancet article says there were more than 5,000 cases of measles and 83 deaths. Kennedy claims the real killer in Samoa was a bad vaccine, and there were 2 deaths because local nurses injected babies with incorrectly mixed vaccines. But what killed more people was Samoa's pulling its vaccine after those babies died. Immunization rates declined sharply. That caused the measles deaths. Kennedy's claim that all the deaths resulted from bad vaccine is just wrong. Fortunately, today, Samoa vaccinates kids again. Finally, about Kennedy's repeated claim that
autism is caused by vaccines. There was a 1,350% elevated risk for autism.
No, there isn't. Kennedy bases his claim on this paper, which found more autism among vaccinated kids. But this was unpublished data. Other researchers controlled for other variables. They found no correlation. And many, many bigger studies find no link between today's vaccines and autism. One even looked at every child born in Denmark over 10 years. Kennedy's anti-vaccine messages hurt people. Vaccines do save lives. Now, his critics claim he just makes things up. We didn't find that. He doesn't just make things up, but he misleads because he ignores bigger, better, more reliable studies. So Kennedy and I disagree about a lot, but he's unusual in that he will appear here and debate these issues. Good for him. That's what America's supposed to be about. If you like my interviews with politicians, make sure to subscribe below, and that way you'll get more of these videos.